This old school fishing technique used to catch a ton of bass, but it doesn't anymore. But wait, it's not because of what you think. My name is Wesley Littlefield with YourBassGuy.com, and today I'm talking about how to fish the tube. That's right, in the previous video you learned about how to rig it. Now it's time to learn how to fish it. But let's get to fishing. So I'm gonna start with the Texas rig. Now, I'm not gonna go super in depth just because I've got other videos explaining how to fish a Texas rig, and fishing a tube on a Texas rig is pretty much the same thing. We're gonna cast it out, and I always let it sink all the way to the bottom. Once I know it's on the bottom, you can see the slack in the line, the bow, then I'll either drag it, and this is, super slow. So I drag it with my rod tip back, and I can feel every little bump on the bottom. Then I reel up the slack, and then I drag it with my rod tip again. Some guys, kind of like a crankbait, will say count the rocks, count the little bumps that you feel, and when you feel a different kind of bump, that's usually a fish. So I usually drag it either when it's cold or when the water is super hot. When the fish are lethargic, they don't want to move, that's when I'm gonna drag it, go slow, go with a slow technique. Now, if the water is warming up, it's it's at mid-spring and through early summer and then into late summer and early fall, then I'm gonna actually fish it a little bit faster. So I'm gonna actually cast it out. Get away from there. And I'm gonna let it sink again, but this time I'm actually gonna reel and bring it in with by reeling it instead of dragging it with my rod. Now there's one technique in between that I'll talk about, and that's called hopping it. So it's the same thing. You're gonna cast it out, you're gonna let it sink, and instead of dragging it with your rod, you're gonna pop your rod. Let me step back and show you. So I'll pop my rod and let it sink back down and go to the bottom, reel up the slack, and do it again. I'll do that one more time. So cast it out, let it sink, reel up my slack, pop it off the bottom, let it sink back down, reel up the rest of my slack once it's back on the bottom, pop it again. Sometimes it's one big pop, sometimes it's 1, 2, sometimes it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's kind of just depends on the mood. You know, one pops when they're feeling a little bit more lethargic, and the 5, 6 pops when they're moving a little bit more. So you can experiment with these and figure out exactly what the fish are wanting in the moment. Next, we're gonna talk about the drop shot. If I'm honest, drop shotting isn't one of my favorite techniques because it's super slow, but it does honestly catch a lot of fish. So I should probably like it more. Anyways, you'll notice the main difference starting off. I've got a spinning rod and reel instead of a bait caster. That's just personal preference. I guess you could use a bait caster to do this. It's a little bit lighter technique, so that's why I go with the spinning reel. Other than that, it's personal. So we're gonna cast it out and let it sink all the way to the bottom, just like we would with the Texas rig. Except this time, I'm gonna reel up my slack and I'm just gonna kind of bounce it. And you'll just see me, kind of like you would with a shaky head, you're just gonna shake that rod tip and have your line pretty tight, not like tight where you're dragging it, but tight enough to where when you move your rod tip, you're moving the bait. And you really don't wanna actually pull it back to you, you just kinda want it to bounce in one spot. Now once you figured that, hey, I ain't getting a bite here, then you can pull it with your rod tip, kind of drag it like you would with the Texas rig. So the next technique that we're gonna talk about is, in fact, dragging it, just like we did with the Texas rig. So we're gonna let it sink all the way to the bottom. We're gonna reel up the slack once it's there, and we're just gonna lift up our rod and drag it back to us. Then as my rod goes down, I reel up the slack and drag it back to me again. Now I don't do this a lot, and most people don't, because like I said, drop shotting is a slow technique. But you can, in fact, cast it out, let it sink all the way to the bottom, and then slow roll it back to you. And this, of course, is obviously when the fish are a little bit more actively feeding, and you know, you're not getting any bites, moving it slow. Maybe pulling it by their face a little bit quicker will entice them to bite, but this is usually a last resort kind of thing for me when drop shotting. The next technique we're going to talk about is with the jig head. Now, I mentioned in that rigging video that I don't like doing it this way because it's a pain in the butt and it's not weedless. However, if you do, there's a way called the stupid tube that I didn't show in that video, and that way is weedless. And so when you rig it the stupid tube way, which is a stupid name, but anyways, when you rig it that way, it is weedless. So then you can punch and flip with it. It just makes the bait a little bit more versatile. So know that I'm not talking about punching, flipping here, but you can actually do that with a tube when you rig it a little bit differently. For this one, honestly, I'm gonna cast it out, and I prefer to have some kind of target in mind. Now, obviously, I don't want a lot of weeds around, and I don't want like a giant brush pile that's gonna grab, or you know, that my hook's gonna grab onto. But I do want a rock pile to target, or some isolated cover to throw out, and I'm just gonna cast it out, let it sink, and pop it off the bottom like I would with a Texas rig. The rigging a tube this way actually has a little bit different action because I have the hook in a different location. So this tube really has just a very different action than a Texas rig. So even though you're popping it like a Texas rig, it's getting a completely different look than it would with a Texas rig. And that's because a tube almost spins and it flips really weird. I'm really more reluctant to just reel it back straight. I mean, it'll run straight at you, but it doesn't have a lot of action like that. So that's one thing I simply won't do rigging a tube this way, is just reeling it straight back to me, because it just doesn't look natural. I think the best way, at least the best way for me, maybe you find it something different, but is literally letting it sink and popping it off that bottom.